bullying, but welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us here at the River Road Visitor and Learning Center at Freedom Park. My name is Jessica. I work for the Friends of Freedom Park, and we operate this facility on behalf of the City of Prescott. So we're delighted to see a great crowd today to consider some different ways of managing your yard and your landscapes, whether it be your public spaces or your private spaces. Here at the park, we are trying to restore a prairie remnant, a globally rare piece of prairie, and we want to make sure that we are protecting that. At the same time, we're doing all of the other stuff with the lawn in a way that people expect to see lawns in a highly trafficked park. So I'm very excited to learn more today. And this is in partnership with Blue Thumb. John back there is from Blue Thumb. So thank you, John, for making all these wonderful arrangements. There's plenty of food over here. Please come back for seconds. We have coffee, water. The restrooms are back out through the glass doors where you came in. If you have any questions, please see me. Again, I'm Jessica or John, and I'll turn it over to James now. Thank you, James.
Okay, so as was just stated, my name is James Wolfin, and when I'm not working with John and the other good folks at Blue Thumb, I'm a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, and I'm in this really unique position where I'm co-advised. One of my advisors is Marla Spivak, who's a professor in entomology who works with mostly honeybees, but also native bees to some extent. And my other advisor is Eric Watkins from horticulture, who does turfgrass science. So I get this really neat perspective from two different disciplines of science that don't cross over much. But one of the topics that I'm going to talk about today, as well as a few different turf alternative options, is how we can support our pollinators and our bees within the context of that urban lawn or any kind of turfgrass dominated area that many of you are going to interact with. So this presentation was developed with help from the following partners. So myself and Sam Bauer representing the University of Minnesota, where I tend to focus on the bee end of things and he tends to focus on the turfgrass science end of things. Organic Bob, who really knows a lot about soils and soil sciences and how different trophic levels, different parts of the food web interact with your soil. And Douglas Owens Pike from Energyscapes, as well as Anna Bierbauer and John Bly from Blue Thumb. So here we're identifying two primary challenges that we face in our yards. So first, runoff, which according to the EPA is the #1 threat to water quality for our streams and lakes. The second is native pollinators, which is really I guess you could call it my expertise, and how they're threatened by pesticides, and really, which is what's more applicable to this presentation, is the lack of forage and lack of habitat. And the vision for Blue Thumb that we want to spread to the homeowners and land managers here today is that we can create beautiful and ecologically functional landscapes in our cities, towns, and suburbs in turfgrass-dominated areas. Well, we can meet these two goals, protecting clean water by minimizing runoff, and supporting our pollinators and trophic levels that interact with them to create thriving ecosystems. So first, why find an alternative to turf? It's existed for hundreds, if not more, years in our landscapes, and it does have its place. It's a hardy surface. You can walk on it, you can play games on it, you can have a picnic. There are many functions of turf, but it also has its drawbacks. And the primary drawbacks that we tend to focus on fall under the umbrella of what we call inputs. So inputs can be in the form of irrigation, it can be in the form of fertilizer. It's any kind of management that you have to apply to your turf that, when done in excess or even just as a byproduct of the action in general, there's some negative effect to go along with it. So I'll cover a few of these briefly here, but I'll talk more about them as the presentation goes on. So first, they can pollute ground and surface waters through over-fertilization. So when we fertilize, we're applying different nutrients to our ground cover, most often in the form of nitrogen, but sometimes phosphorus as well. And when we apply too much of this, or they don't get absorbed by the soils, they can be carried by water into nearby waterways, thus polluting our streams. Also, overwatering. So when we irrigate a lawn, especially here in that Wisconsin-Minnesota border where we receive plentiful rainfall, if we're applying irrigation and our soils are already saturated, a lot of that water is going to leave our lawn or whatever turfgrass area we're managing in the form of runoff. And one other one that I really tend to focus on is, as we currently manage turfgrass areas, they don't really function ecologically. We either have a monoculture of turfgrass or a mixture of different turfgrass species, but either way, one, the these turfgrass species don't get to flower because we mow them, and even if they were to flower, they don't provide nutritious rewards for our pollinators. And it's the pollen and nectar that come from inflorescences that these pollinators really need in order to survive and thrive. So it's important to understand the state of turfgrass in the United States before I kind of go into the nitty-gritty details about turfgrass and turfgrass science. So turfgrass accounts for 2% of the continental US, and these areas highlighted in green all represent high areas of turfgrass density. So what you'll notice is a trend where it's really most prevalent in urban and suburban areas, and with more and more people moving to suburbs and these urban areas, so it's gone from 2 to 3% of our nation living in suburbs or urban areas. 2% of the country used to be defined as a suburb or an urban area, and that's since expanded to 3% in about the past 3 years. So a greater percentage of Americans live in those urban areas, but just the percent of country that's classified has increased over time. And turf areas now account for 50,000 square miles, and that's more than 3 times the size of the irrigated corn in the United States. So we want to create a solution to kind of overcome the increased number of inputs that we see, to overcome this challenge of how can we support our pollinators. So we're going to present 3 different options, ranging from kind of the most familiar, where we're finding a nice balance between ecological function and human function, and slowly moving down the road in favor of ecological function. So the first option I'll discuss today is low maintenance turf. So we're staying under the umbrella of we're still incorporating turfgrass species, but we're changing the species such that we reduce the number of inputs, or rather the amount of inputs that these surfaces need, and therefore they're a little more eco-friendly. So the 2 questions you want to ask yourself as I go through this is, what kind of lawn appearance am I okay with? Because we are going to be sacrificing turfgrass quality a little bit in favor of some ecological function. And 2, how much traffic does my lawn receive? So many of these turfgrass species don't have that same resistance to wear and tear that a typical Kentucky bluegrass or perennial ryegrass lawn has. So if you have maybe a lot of sport activity on your lawn, or a bunch of dogs running through where their sharp nails can kind of create some wear damage, then maybe you want to use a mixture of grass species where you can still have something survive in a high wear situation. But these are just 2 questions that you want to ask yourself when you consider low maintenance turf. So when I talk about a low maintenance or low input lawn, I'll be using those terms maintenance and input interchangeably. There's a few key qualities that we're thinking about within these types of lawns. The first is drought tolerance, which ties directly into how much you have to irrigate the surface. So a drought-tolerant lawn can go for a longer duration without being watered. And here in Minnesota, with how much rain we get, or I guess in Wisconsin rather, I'm so used to being in Minnesota. We're not too far away, so I'm not off by too much. So here in Wisconsin rather, where we do get a suitable amount of precipitation, you really don't have to be watering your lawns too much as is in the spring and summer. But drought tolerance is something that we view as a positive quality in a lawn because they don't need to be watered as frequently. The second trait we like to think about is the rate of growth, which ties directly into how frequently you have to mow. So the species I'm going to discuss today have a slower rate of growth than a typical perennial ryegrass or Kentucky bluegrass lawn, so you don't have to mow quite as frequently throughout the growing season. And third is fertility needs, so the more you fertilize, the more of that excess nitrogen or phosphorus has the potential to escape your lawn. So if there's lower fertility needs, you have fewer of those nutrients escaping into nearby waterways. Disease resistance and insect resistance, those aren't really things that we're all too concerned with. It has to do with kind of root feeding and the prevalence of different diseases like snow mold. But it's really those first 3 traits that we're more focused on. So the environmental benefits of low maintenance lawns. So this kind of directly relates to what I just said, but we're preventing soil erosion, so if you're irrigating less, you have less soil being carried away. We're filtering contaminants, and a couple other ones that I really like to focus on are 1, carbon sequestration. So we know that carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is a very big issue, global warming, they're all tied together. And what really any green space has to do, especially a turfgrass lawn, is the ability to sequester carbon. So you take that atmospheric carbon dioxide and you convert that carbon back into usable forms. So it comes back into our soil where it can be used for really any life process that requires carbon, and since we're carbon-based organisms on this planet, that really goes a long way. The second thing that I like to focus on is the release of oxygen into our atmosphere. So once again, anytime you have a green surface, you're releasing oxygen, which of course we all need for aerobic respiration. So the gold medal turfgrass species for these low input lawns are species that fall under the umbrella of the fine fescues. So one cultivar that I'm especially fond of is hard fescue, but really any of the fine fescues will work. You kind of choose a cultivar based on the specific needs of your lawn. So the positives is that this species of grass, or all the species of fine fescues, tend to have these low input qualities. They have low fertility needs, so about 1/6 the fertility needs of that of a traditional Kentucky bluegrass lawn. They're slow growing, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. And they also do really well in the shade or sun. So they don't really have to be watered all too frequently. They have really strong drought tolerance. And the only real negative that we see with this grass, outside of snow mold, which is kind of tied to aesthetics, it's not something that's gonna really kill the entirety of your lawn, is that it doesn't quite have the traffic tolerance that is desired and that we see in a Kentucky bluegrass lawn or the traditional lawn types. So if you do have a situation where the lawn you manage is a high traffic lawn, what we would then recommend is doing a mixture of species. So fine fescue will co-establish really well with the Kentucky bluegrass or those other high traffic lawn types. So you can still mix species, and where high traffic is a major stressor, the Kentucky bluegrass will arise, but in cases where that's not the instance, you'll have a nice kind of mix of the two grass species, creating a lower input lawn than what you had previously. So going back to the growth rate, what's starting to come to market more and more is this idea of the no-mow mixture. And no-mow might be a little bit of an exaggeration or possibly a marketing pitch on the side of, your Menards, Home Depot, whoever your turf seed provider is. But it is kind of a less mow mixture. So rather than mowing, I'll be optimistic and say once a month, but I imagine for a lot of you it's probably more frequent than that. You can get away with mowing once or twice per year. So I have some sites for my research where we use these no-mow mixtures. Right outside the B Lab at the University of Minnesota, we use these no-mow mixtures, and we've been doing really well with this regimen where we mow only twice a year, and we really lower the inputs that are associated with the mower. So less fossil fuels being released. So here are some examples of no-mow mixtures that we've seen in use. And the second picture on your right is actually right outside of, I believe, Alderman Hall at the St. Paul campus of the University of Minnesota. So this first option that I've mentioned is even more so than being grass-like. It is a turfgrass species. But going one step further down the line, there are a couple of grass-like options or newer grasses that are still being worked on that either are even more low input than what we already have or have the potential to make great low input surfaces. So sedges, there are many different types of sedges that will function very similar to that of a typical turf grass, but they're even more low input. The first of which is Pennsylvania sedge, which is really well adapted for sunny, dry conditions. So that means you're really lowering the amount of irrigation that this surface needs. You shouldn't really have to water it at all in these landscapes. If you go an extended period of time of drought, so an extended period of time with no rain, then it would be okay to apply some irrigation. The second species that we like to think about as far as sedges is Plains oval sedge. So now rather than drought tolerance, we're thinking of shade tolerance. So this is a species that if you have some large oaks or native trees in your yard where there's a lot of shade present, it will survive in the presence of shade. So with lack of sun, this species does really well. So prairie June grass, or Calaria, and all the species that fall under the umbrella of Calaria, is kind of a newer species of turf grass that's being explored. So it's native to our North American prairies, and it has really great low input potential, but right now it isn't produced at the densities and doesn't have the coverage rate and those kind of traditional turf grass qualities, uniformity, green, that's desired in the lawn. But as we continue to do more research and breed for these qualities, This is something that we hope will come to the market soon, and while it may be a bit more expensive, that's kind of balanced by input costs. So lower input costs can kind of counterbalance the high cost of seed that we project for this species. And these other preferred grasses kind of follow that same trend, where they're either not perfectly adapted for the north central area, or we need more research and breeding to make them publicly available. But it's that same trend of, although there's that initial upfront cost, hopefully you make it back by putting in fewer inputs, and that there's really great potential for these to be super low input management areas. So the second option, so now we're going from a little bit more human focused to a little bit more ecological focused, is what I really tend to focus on for my personal research, and something that Blue Thumb is incorporating themselves are these pollinator-friendly lawns. So once again, you want to think, how comfortable am I with changing my the picture I have in my mind of the perfect aesthetic lawn, and how much use does my area get? Because here, if we're bringing in pollinators, you probably won't want to be barefoot on the lawn. There's a little bit of a higher risk of stinging, but we're really getting more ecological function out of these lawns. So what I want to do with my research, and what I'm hoping will become more prevalent throughout the Twin Cities, North Central, really anywhere, is I want to redesign the turf lawn. So we're so used to this monoculture, this mixture of grass species being the desired aesthetic, and what I hope to do is introduce these low-growing forbs, these low-growing flowers that can provide really great forage for our pollinators. So we still have grass present, so you can walk on it, you can play on it, but now we're also providing some ecological function. We're bringing back pollinators, which brings back wildlife. So how does a bee lawn function? And I'll talk about this a little bit from the human perspective, but I'm really going to focus mostly on the pollinator's perspective. So the main thing is we're keeping that low maintenance profile. So as I mentioned before with the low maintenance turfs, we're minimizing all of those inputs, the mowing, watering, weeding, and fertilizing. So weeding isn't something that I talked about before, but now with flowers that you would traditionally view as weeds, we're viewing them as forage for our pollinators. So we're kind of altering perceptions. And the grass species that's ideal for these lawns is still fine fescue, so that's how we're able to maintain that low input nature. So as I said, we want to maintain the aesthetics and function of the lawn. So I'm not trying to pitch to you these large prairie flowers that bloom at 16 inches, 2 feet, etc. Instead, we're really restricting to mostly low flowers, ideally flowers that bloom as low as 2.5 or 3.5 inches off the ground. So to understand the benefits of a bee lawn or implementing pollinator habitat, there's a really great paper that came out a year ago from a study in the Chicago, Illinois area, where they wanted to quantify the benefits of converting lawn or converting to pollinator-friendly forage in terms of pollination. And what they found was that converting just 5% of a turfgrass surface to pollinator-friendly forage will result in improved pollination. And as urban gardens and urban farms are becoming more and more prevalent throughout our urban and suburban areas, this can really have great impact in our local communities. So the preferred low floral species, a lot of this is based on some research that we do at the University of Minnesota, and a lot of this is based on kind of observational or pilot studies through Blue Thumb. But there's a common theme in all of this, that we want flowers that will first establish in Minnesota soils. Second, they have the ability to survive a mowing event, which I'm sure, as you can imagine, is really stressful on a flowering species, and also continue to flower after being mowed, and finally serve as high-quality forage for wild bees. So when I talk about high-quality forage, I'm thinking about the sugars in the nectar and the protein that's present in the pollen. And we do make an effort to incorporate native flowers, but we also install some non-natives, and I'll talk more about kind of how those non-natives function in the lawn. So the first flower that we've highlighted is Self-Heal, and this is a flower that I absolutely adore because not only do people really love it for the aesthetics, that beautiful green color it has, but it's also kind of gives you an instant impact. So for most flowers, when you seed them into a lawn, you generally have to wait a few seasons before it'll start to bloom. So it might germinate in year one, you might see vegetation, but they don't normally bloom right away. With Self-Heal, it's a native flower that comes to bloom in year one and does a great job of attracting larger bees. So I see tons and tons of bumblebees on this, as well as some other native bees that tend to have that larger body size. And the reason we're seeing larger bees is that that longer corolla, so kind of the neck of the flower, in order for a bee to reach down into the neck of that flower, they need a long tongue, and a long tongue is very strongly correlated with a large body size.
Excuse me, is that a perennial and not an annual thing?
Yes. So I believe all, if not most, of the flowers I'll discuss today are perennials, and this self-heal is certainly a perennial. So kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum, from the bee's perspective that is creeping thyme. So rather than these slightly larger, kind of long corolla blooms, we're seeing smaller blooms that are pretty wide open. And what this does is now it gives you a resource that kind of targets your smaller pollinators, your smaller bees. So ground nesting bees like Andrena and Lacioglossom will tend to use this flower. And what's also really great about this is it's kind of really well suited for low input lawns because of its drought tolerance, and especially Minnesota or north central lawns, so Wisconsin as well, where winter hardiness can be a major concern. So you really need flowers that can get through those harsh winters, and creeping thyme does a really great job of that. And also, this might not be applicable in most urban and suburban areas, but it does tend to function as a natural deer deterrent where they don't like the scent and the taste of creeping thyme. So if maybe you have an issue of a deer getting into your garden and messing up your garden crops, I'll be straightforward here. I'm from Queens, New York, so I don't interact with deer and wildlife outside of pigeon and raccoon that much. But I've been told that deer can be an issue in this part of the country, so I like to throw that little tidbit in there. Yes?
Because this is a creeper, is it difficult to contain if you wanted to isolate it?
So there can be some difficulty in containing it, but it doesn't tend to be aggressive to the point where it's going to outcompete native flowers or your grasses. If you have a concern about it sneaking into a neighbor's yard, there are some management strategies that I can recommend, and I can touch on that real quick. So what I like to recommend is a border. So most people have a property line or a fence line, and rather than having your grass or whatever ground cover you have reaching the full extent of that property line, you want to create a little barrier, whether it be a rock bed or some mulch, something that's going to restrict the ability of those plant roots to extend beyond where you manage your land. Because while people in this room might be really receptive to having flowers in their lawn, that doesn't mean that your neighbor next door is. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. So Dutch white clover, so I mentioned before that the fine fescues are kind of the gold medal of low input turf. Dutch white clover, every time I hear someone refer to this species as a weed, I die a little bit inside, because to me this is the ultimate bee lawn flower. It's an unbelievable source of forage for our pollinators. So from my research alone, I can tell you that over 40 species of bees use this as forage, and in Minnesota where I study, that's over 10% of all the bees that exist in our state. And I know it might not sound like much to you, but that is just an incredibly high number of species using one flower. So now, rather than having a large bloom that's targeting large pollinators or a small bloom that's targeting small pollinators, we have a pretty wide open, medium-sized bloom where bees of kind of all shapes and sizes can use it. And that's really because of the way that the petals are organized. So a smaller bee will rest itself on one or two of those little petals, reach down, get some nectar, get some pollen. But a larger pollinator will use the whole inflorescence as a landing pad before reaching down to get the rewards that it needs. So it's a great source of both nectar and pollen, so pollen high in protein content, nectar high in sugar content, and it even functions as a nitrogen fixer. So a nitrogen fixer is any plant, mostly legumes, that take atmospheric nitrogen, work it back into our ground. So they're kind of doing some natural fertilizing of our lawns. So it reduces the amount of nitrogen input that's required in a lawn area. So with these past few species, I have mentioned some non-native flowers, so it's useful to get some expert opinions that aren't my own, because clearly I'd be biased. So some thoughts from experts in the field about these non-native species. So first is from Neil from the National Park Service, who says that although Dutch white clover has been in the United States for a long time and is more or less naturalized. And what naturalized means is that it is not native to the place where you're finding it, but it's also not going to outcompete any non-native species. So it's kind of not posing a threat to any of the natives that we want to keep present. And he goes on to say, I generally don't see it outcompeting native species. So yeah, just kind of further defining what a naturalized plant does. We also have a little quote from the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum that says, while non-native flowers may be aggressive, they can still be very useful. So Dutch white clover and creeping thyme, so the Latin name for creeping thyme is actually Thymus serpyllum. I guess Dutch white clover's Latin name got posted in twice there. So these are two species that will benefit our pollinators and can survive within a mowed lawn. So some more species that are either kind of experimental or they're for more observational studies, I'll talk about those now. So common violet, Viola sororia, is a species that we've seen just in many home fronts, and we've seen it coexisting with grass species. And what this does is it's an early blooming species. So here in the north central, it's really difficult to find flowers that will bloom as soon as April, where we're not even outside of the last freeze in April here. And it also survives in sun or shade. So it's really well adapted to the northern climates as an early blooming species to provide that kind of early nectar kick that our pollinators need. So here is just a little image of common violet in a natural setting. I believe this is in the Minneapolis area, and you can see it coexisting with turf quite nicely. So now I'll go over a few more species that I've been working with personally, as well as some that Blue Thumb has been looking at. So calico aster, we typically think of asters as flowers that bloom at least 12 inches, and calico aster is no different. It does bloom reaching 12, 18, maybe even 2 feet tall. But what we've been really excited to find is that when you mow it back to the height of a typical lawn, 2.5, really more so 3.5 inches, it will still bloom at this height as well. And the reason I love this flower, so I'm always thinking from the pollinator's point of view, is the variation we see in the color of that disc floret. So if you follow the petals to the middle of the flower, you see different colors of the disc florets. And one of the things that a pollinator reacts to as it's trying to determine where I want to eat is what colors am I seeing? And different bees like different colors. So some like purples, some like yellows, and those are a few of the different colors that we see in these disc florets, so it means that we can attract a wider diversity of pollinators. So once again, this is a flower that serves as both a nectar and a pollen source. The second flower that's being considered is prairie groundsel, and this is another flower where we generally think of it as a taller species, blooming at about a foot, but the vegetation is very different. The vegetation tends to grow at just 3 inches height, meaning that it can do really well in a mowed scenario where you're mowing to right around 3 inches. And this is really well adapted for dry sites, so maybe you have a sandy soil or a full sun site. So it allows you to put in some vegetation into a dry site without adding too much irrigation. So now moving over to option 3, perennial ground cover, and now we're really focusing in on ecological impact. So we do have to sacrifice a little bit of that human aspect, using your lawn area as kind of an area to play or conduct human activities, but we're really maximizing that ecological input. And some additional considerations is that these also tend to be a little bit more pricey and a little bit more effort is required, so generally about 2 to 3 growing seasons to really get this form of ground cover going. But we're really, once again, maximizing that ecological function. So what we're essentially trying to do is create a small prairie or a micro meadow within our own yard. So this can be in the form of native grasses and low-growing flowers. There's many ways that you can go about this, and I'll kind of introduce those ideas here. And of course, we're trying to conserve our pollinators, so this be in all other different bee species. So with perennial ground covers, we're really maximizing those ecological benefits, and you have to think about your location and whether or not the area that you manage can kind of is able to sacrifice the human function for the ecological function. So I'll go over the different steps involved, from removing and replacing the sod all throughout the installation of plants, and we're going back to that main question of turf alternatives and where are they appropriate. So we're thinking about the location that we manage and the conditions of that area, so things like the type of soil we have, sunlight, I'll go over all those different conditions shortly. So location. So I've been talking mostly about lawn areas, and it may be difficult for a lot of people to sacrifice the entirety of their lawn. We do want to have some ecological function, some human function in these areas, but there are other locations within urban and suburban areas that are dominated by turf grass that naturally see less human foot traffic. And one of those areas is a health strip. And what Blooming Boulevards is doing with these areas is they're creating what they call blooming boulevards, where they take out the grass and they replace it with different forms of perennial ground cover. And when you install these perennials, now you need to think about spacing a little bit more. So with when we're talking about the low forbs I was talking about for a bee lawn, you can seed them just with a drop spreader. You're not worrying about spacing or the rate that you seed it out all too much. With these forms of perennial ground cover, the vegetation is a little bit larger. It needs a little bit more kind of elbow room. So you want to give it at least 6 to 8 inches in between plantings. There's also slopes. So with a slope in turf grass, we struggle to get really anything to bloom there. But sometimes it's a little bit easier to get a plant with deeper roots kind of anchored into the ground there. There's also right-of-ways, so the area along a roadside where we're starting to see more and more pollinator-friendly plantings go in and sort of ditching that turf grass norm that we're used to. And naturalized areas, so prairies, different grasslands where we generally think of kind of a mixture of perennial ground cover and grasses. These are areas that have the potential to go to full perennial ground cover, maximize ecological function. So things to consider, once again, traffic and use, soil and drainage, sun and shade, and I'll elaborate on that as we go. So what we want to think about first is use. So how is your lawn used? If it sees high traffic and foot traffic, you're not going to want to have really, large flowers where it restricts your ability to have a picnic, play a game, etc. These are mostly for low use areas. And also, so this is kind of more related to a health strip, but is the boulevard you're working with, is it likely to see lots of salt from the road? So we get tons of snow here, salt is put down to prevent that, and if that salt carries over into our boulevards, sometimes that can impart a stress upon the plants that we want to establish, and it can be more difficult to get these plants to grow. So moving on to soil conditions, I think soil conditions is kind of something that might be an afterthought to people, but whenever I'm thinking how can I get a plant to the ground, it's the first thing that you want to consider. And just to give a real quick visual representation of that, if we were to compare, I want to compare a sandy soil to a loam soil. So a sandy soil site, even though we tend to associate sand with really small particles, when we're talking about soil, we're talking about the largest particle size. So in terms of all of our soil covers, sand has the largest particles, which means it has the most potential for water to move through it, and less water is being retained in that kind of top of the soil bed where roots grow and plants need water to establish. So this isn't to say that plants can't establish in sandy soils, it's just more so that you have to be thinking about plants that are less sensitive to water retention and are more drought tolerant when you're picking a plant for a sandy soil site. If you compare that instead to a loam site, these are sites that really hold more water, so you kind of have a wider range of plants that you can consider. There are also some challenges associated with heavy clay, and this ties right into drainage. So some soils really just absorb a ton of water and retain a lot of moisture, but clay soils tend to be a little bit hydrophobic, meaning they don't absorb quite as much water, and more water, when irrigated, can be lost in the form of runoff. We also want to think of the light conditions of a site. So shade, I'm sure many of you probably have shady areas in your lawn or the area that you manage where you struggle to get things to grow. And what you really need there is a shade-adapted cultivar or a shade-adapted species that can survive even when there's a limited level of sunlight. So here are some forms of perennial ground cover that do really well when in the presence of shade. So nearest you kind of in the foreground is some violets, and violets as a whole, as a genera, tend to do a really job of surviving despite shade. Now we have kind of a more, just like a poor quality soil, so a really dry soil that's sandy in nature. And here we have a species that just does really well in these kind of low nutrient situations, so it doesn't need too much water. It can survive in full sun. So now to installation. So we've kind of covered the different options that are available, but how do we physically get these into the ground? And there's a few different steps that I'll go through, but just to give a quick summary to have in your mind as we go through, we need to first remove the existing plantings. 2, replenish the soil, so make sure that we have some really good quality soil for our plants to go. 3, install our own plants. And 4, maintain these plants throughout at least the first year, but really for as long as you want to have them present in your lawn. So there are 4 different options that we're going to cover for removing existing plantings, and they really have different benefits and drawbacks. So mostly in the terms of effort versus ecological benefit and even cost, and I'll go through each of those here. So sod removal is pretty straight up, and many of you are probably pretty familiar with this. You're using a sod cutter or a sod kicker to physically just tear that sod out of the ground and then replace it with your own desired lawn cover. So this, although it's very eco-friendly, you're generally not, you don't have too many inputs going on here. The drawback is, and I'm sure if you've done it before you know this can be a major pain in, we're on TV, this can be really difficult. So, so this is kind of going to be based on how much effort you're willing to put in, how much strain you really want to impart on yourself. The second type of ground cover removal that we're going to consider is solarization. So solarization is quite simply putting any layer of plastic, you generally want a clear plastic, over your lawn area that you want to remove, and you generally want to restrict this to not the largest area, you want to do it in sections. And I'll give a quick summary of solarization, but really the Xerxes Society provides an incredible step-by-step guide on how to do this. But the overall goal is, or the premise is, you put a sheet of plastic over the lawn area, and what that plastic does is it collects heat, and it really builds up heat through the duration of the growing season such that everything that was present there initially will die out, and at the end of the growing season, you peel off the plastic, you remove the dead vegetation, and you seed whatever your preference is over the area that you've just uncovered. So sheet mulching, as you can tell by the many steps that are listed here, is a little bit of a longer, more extensive, more steps required in the process, but they're really not too difficult, and I'll go over them with a few quick summaries of each step. So the first step, quite simply, cut her down. So you want to mow that area really short, really to grow to the ground, but you're going to leave those clippings as they can recycle some really nice nutrients into your ground cover. So you slash the vegetation and leave it, and what you are going to remove is any large woody materials that are left present in the ground. Next, you want to apply molasses to your ground cover. So you don't really need all too much, just a quarter cup, for each 2 gallons of water that you add, and this is enough to cover a 300 square foot area. Next, you want to add compost, anywhere between a 1/4 inch and 1 inch of quality compost. So you don't want to just buy, generic box, big box store compost without researching and making sure that it's high quality. And I will a little bit later on talk about what makes for a high quality compost, but you do just want to make sure that you research and see some reviews on the compost you're buying before you go ahead and buy it. Next, you want to lay down your cardboard. So I'm sure not everyone here just has 2 to 3 layers of thick cardboard lying around. So if you don't have that, just a ton of newspaper can make for a good replacement, but some mixture of cardboard, newspaper with a few layers throughout to cover your new area that you want to reseed, and you really want to soak it, so have it retain water, and what this will do is it'll help the cardboard or the newspaper adhere, so it'll really help it stick together and stay compact, and after you soak it, it really allows that cardboard to stay in place. So after you have the cardboard present, now you're finally ready to start adding that compost and adding your new plant material. So you add your soil and compost mixture about 1 inch thick, and then you seed it with really many different forms of ground cover. So crimson clover, which is a really nice forage for pollinators, buckwheat, other cover crops, and you can even just settle for wood or mulch, which helps for water retention. So another Another form of removing ground cover that you probably wouldn't expect an ecologist to recommend is the use of herbicides. But not all herbicides are really super dangerous. So there are some options all presented here, ranging from acetic acid to eugenol, citric acid, or even some other. So it says here non-selective herbicides, but what you actually want is a very selective herbicide. So you're selecting only for the species that you want to get rid of. So you're selecting only for turf grass. So if you have a non-selective herbicide, what that means is it's broad spectrum, and it's going to kill most of the vegetation indiscriminately. With a selective herbicide, you're only killing the species that you want to get rid of. And after this, you want to allow for tilling for about 2 weeks. And finally, replenishing the soil. So when we impart these different maintenance efforts, these different forms of management, we really want to make sure that we're not disrupting the soil too much. We're making sure that we have really high quality soil for plants to grow and for the animals that either nest in the soil, feed on soil microbes. Yeah?
Speaking of soil health,
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, when you were talking about the molasses,
Mm-hmm.
adding the molasses, does that have to do with soil health, like the bacteria in the soil, or is there something else?
So I'm not really a expert in that area of soil management. I don't normally do the the sheet mulching that's recommended here, but that's something that Blue Thumb and the landscape architects that are associated with Blue Thumb have a lot of information on. So I believe they have some informational packets that can give some additional information, or John or the other landscape architects can give you a little bit more information on exactly how that molasses functions.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm replenishing the soil. So think about soil structure and also how it interacts with water. So hydrophobic soil, like the ones pictured here, so hydro means water, phobic means fear, so they don't interact well with water, which means they're not retaining too much water. They're not retaining a lot of water when irrigation or rain is present. With our soils, we really want hydrophilic soils, soils that interact really well with water and can absorb a ton of water, so we don't see too much getting lost in the form of runoff. We also don't really tend to think about how soil interacts with our food web. So soil is really the foundation, the basis of our food webs. As you see many bacteria and fungi feeding directly on the soil or the roots that grow within it, as well as different types of nematodes and even arthropods that use the soil as its nesting area. So here is a really great image. I believe this is using a scanning electron microscope, just a really high-powered microscope of a nematode caught within a fungal hyphae. And this nematode, it feeds on soil and it also provides nutrition for lots of larger organisms. So we're thinking at each trophic level and moving from step to step. So here's a really great table that I like to talk about for just a little bit. And what we're looking at is kind of the different trophic levels, different levels of biological diversity that exist within soil. So in just 1 teaspoon of soil, we see hundreds of millions of bacteria, but even moving up to different levels of the food web, we're seeing arthropods, so that can be small insects, it could be other critters like just other arthropods, and also some earthworms. So greater than 4 earthworms per teaspoon of soil was something that really astounded me. So now the types of composts that you can consider. So these aren't the only forms of compost, but these are some that Blue Thumb tends to recommend. And once again, if you want more information on the different types of compost you should be considering, you should contact one of your landscape architects to read more of that informational pamphlet. But some general trends in the compost we're looking at is that they're very microbe rich. So these microbes, once again, they're the basis of that food web. They are what allow larger forms of life, all the way up to mammals and birds, the wildlife that we really interact more with and have that more charismatic association with. It all starts at the microbial level and builds up. So they're also aerobic, which means they're oxygen rich, which all, or really most organisms need. And the second type of compost that we consider is compost tea. So this is a very, very high quality source of compost, which I'm sure that John, the people at Blue Thumb, and Organic Bob, who's really an expert on different types of compost, different types of soils, would really hope for you to use. And that's directly again related to the microbes. So you have a really both high abundant and diverse microbe population, which works its way up the food web and allows for greater biodiversity across the board. So more diverse microbes means more diverse arthropods, which work its way up to more diverse birds, mammals, etc. So now the different cover crops that you can install in the form of perennial ground cover. So there's a lot of different options here, but the ones that I tend to really love for these lawn areas are the ones with the L next to it. So what that L stands for is legume, and legumes have this property where they take that atmospheric nitrogen and work it back into the soil. So we're seeing that added benefit of being able to recycle nitrogen and input less fertilizer into the ground. So tillage radish is one of the cover crops mentioned in that previous slide. And what we see with radishes is that microbes and worms really love them. So even though we don't really tend to think about these forms of biodiversity too much, there's the trophic levels above them still interact with them. So birds will eat the worms. The microbes are super important in the diets of pollinators like bees. And they also work to break up soil compaction. So it's kind of almost like a natural aerator that you're putting through your lawn. So it kind of takes a core of soil out and improves the flow of oxygen and other nutrients throughout your lawn cover. So installation. So how do we get these forms of lawn cover into the ground? So especially with the bee lawns that I was talking about before, scalping is going to be an incredibly important process, as well as the perennial lawn cover. So we mentioned the cutter down. This is kind of the cutter down phase. So a scalp is defined as any mow of turf grass 1 inch or less. And I recognize that we don't all have access to an industrial size or an industrial quality lawnmower. So what you want to do really is just mow to as low as you can. And what we're trying to do here is improve seed to soil contact ratios. So in order for any plant to establish, the seed has to hit the ground in order to start its germination phase. So if you were to drop that seed into a high turf, a lot of that seed is going to get caught up in the grass and never reach the ground. Instead, if you are to mow to as low as you can, there's kind of less turf grass is going to catch those seeds, more seeds will hit the ground, and then you'll have greater germination. So secondly, we also want to use aeration. So an aerator, so kind of the more mechanical way of doing what those radishes are doing, you're removing cores of soil from the ground. And what you're hoping to do is increase the flow of nutrients like oxygen, increase the flow of nutrients, water, and air through the ground. And the general premise here is that if you can increase the overall health of your lawn, you can increase the ability of flowers and perennials to establish within it. So finally, when you seed, you can also do a complete vegetation removal, which incorporates a soil turnover, so turning the soil. So this is exactly what it sounds like. You're physically removing the soil, turning it over, and then you're going to smooth the surface with a rake, so rake it back into the ground. And this is doing somewhat similar, but a little more extensive, a little more thorough even than the scalping, is you're really improving that seed to soil contact. So now there's less vegetation that's going to compete with your seeds. They're touching the soil bed directly, and they're going to be more likely to germinate and eventually bloom. So some options for fast results is that some nurseries, I know in the Twin Cities, and I'm sure out here as well, are willing to install no-mow mixes as sod. So a really popular one are these rhizomatous tall fescues, and there are also some fine fescue sods out there as well that you can get a turfgrass nursery or ground cover company like Rainbow Tree Care is one that I know does it in the Twin Cities area to install a low input or a no-mow sod, which is kind of it's a little bit more costly, but it's going to be instantaneous results. So ongoing maintenance. So after these plants are in the ground, what will you have to do to ensure success? And what you will have to do is you won't have to do any more frequent mowing, but you might want to adjust your mowing practices. So the general setting for a lawnmower that most homeowners and land managers use is mowing to about 2.5 inches and letting it grow to about 4 inches. What we hope to do instead is have homeowners mow to 3 or even 4 inches if you really okay with kind of altering the aesthetic in your lawn and following the rule of 1/3. So the rule of 1/3 within turf grass science suggests that to have the highest quality lawn, you never want to mow more than 1/3 of the vegetation. So you want to go from, if you're at the 3-inch setting, from 4.5 inches to 3, or if you're at the 4-inch mow setting, from 6 inches to 4 inches. So here's a visual representation of what a slightly higher lawn would look like. So I believe on your left is between 4 and 6 inches, and on your right is kind of that traditional height for a lawn. So no-mow issues. So the main issue that we find in a no-mow lawn is heavy thatch. And heavy thatch is the dead organic matter that's associated with lawn. So because we're allowing it to grow for longer, there is a little bit more potential for dead plant material to build up at the interface between the soil bed and the turf. So what we would recommend to do is that after your foliage greens up in the spring, is you want to use a dethatcher. So a dethatcher is a machine in the turf grass industry that just removes that dead organic material but allows your plants to survive. And in the instance where your dethatcher removes some plant material, you're going to want to overseed those areas with no-mow grasses or whatever form of ground cover you desire. So remember, weed control really starts from the soil up. So we often think short-term where, it's the start of a growing season, I have a weed. We never really think of a weed in terms of succession. So before human intervention, weeds were really just the predecessor to other types of vegetation. So eventually weeds which to me are flowers, so herbs and flowers like clover, dandelion, etc., over time, if given hundreds of years, they would be replaced by grasses, shrubs, and eventually trees. So here's just a little example of kind of a more naturalistic lawn cover site. And while you are giving up some of that kind of aesthetic pristine, some of that aesthetic beauty, you are allowing for enhanced ecological function. So you're mowing less, you're allowing some wildlife to take place. And now I guess I just have to go over the resources that made this talk possible. So Organic Bob, he created many of the slides and gave a lot of information about soil quality, and how it interacts with your lawn. The partners at Blue Thumb, John and everyone else who helped create this presentation and the associated packets. If you want some more information about different turfgrass cultivars and species, the University of Minnesota Turfgrass website provides some really great cultivar comparisons, some really great species information, and they even have an extension scientist by the name of Sam Bauer who helped make this presentation, who is really a great expert and can deal with kind of more specialized issues. So if you have some concerns about your specific lawn that you would like answers to, Sam can often provide the information to help overcome that, and different references that were used in making this presentation. Okay, so from here I believe we have some time for questions. Is that correct, John?
Yeah, so couple things. I've got some surveys I'm going to pass out, and then if you could fill them out and leave them on the table where you signed in. If you didn't sign in, could you sign in on your way out, please? And then our plan is to kind of have a facilitated conversation. Think about, you go home, sleep on what you've learned, and then you call in sick tomorrow and you start your turf grass, your alternative turf installation. What barriers are you going to run into? What more information do you need? Because if you're going to run into it, someone else in this room is going to run into it too, and we have some time, we can talk about that. Surveys. And then the last thing about the molasses and the soil health. This is Organic Bob's really big shtick. He's been taking care of lawns organically longer than I've been alive, and he's does it firsthand, and then he also keeps up on all the research. And people are starting to think about soils the same way that doctors are starting to think about our own guts. There's got to be a lot of diversity and microbial activity in a healthy gut. And so the purpose of that molasses is to feed those microbes before you cover them up. so that they kind of go on a feeding frenzy and consume all of the organic matter, the grass that you just mowed down and any weed seeds in the weed bank and stuff. Yeah, I think that covers everything. So I'm going to pass this out, and then we could have some facilitated conversation and questions.
I got one.
So, John's okay to start the questions now? Okay, yeah.
So a lot of us are getting writer's cramp trying to keep up with your talk. You really raced through a lot of things. Could you post this PowerPoint on Jessica's site or Blue Plum so we can take time to look at what your some of your slides?
So now you're kind of going up the levels of the bureaucracy. So I don't know if John can answer that, and if he doesn't know the answer, he'll have to talk to someone higher up. So what's the rule on posting the slides?
You have, if you signed in, we have your email. I can't answer it 100%, but we can share at least some of the slides with the most information. The handouts provided are also kind of walk through some of the steps that James went through.
I'm thinking of those slides that we actually went through the species or the types, and you'd mentioned on the top, but there's a lot of info what we should look for with those specific plantings, for example.
Okay.
That would be helpful to go back and look at.
Okay, well, so for the bee lawn part of this is information that I've conducted myself. So the University of Minnesota Bee Lab website has a lot of resources that discuss the flowers. There's brochures on on the different species, where we talk about the different species, how to install them properly, the management that goes into ensuring that these species establish successfully. Also, if anyone wants to contact me personally, I wouldn't be doing this research if I didn't want people to actually use it and install it. So I'm willing to give my email out to anyone that wants it. So I can either answer some of those questions firsthand, but as far as actually posting the slide, that's for John and Blue Thumb to decide.
Like the U of M B, you got other questions, but the U of M B, what did you say, lab?
Bee Lab, yeah.
Is there a website there that you should tell us?
So if you Google the two words Bee Lab, it's always the first hit. But I believe it should be in this presentation, I'm sure. Let's see.
Thanks.
So it's not here, but I believe it's, a quick Google search will do the trick. I think it's blab.umn.edu, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yep.
That's the one? Okay. Yeah?
Well, I just have a question about public spaces. We spend a lot of time managing really marginal areas.
Yep.
Have there been any studies done that can help us figure out how we kind of go from managing some of these marginal areas and divert those resources into better purposes? Budgets are always really strapped.
Yeah. So there are some species that are well adapted to those marginal areas. In fact, at one of the points where I was kind of fumbling for words, marginal area was actually what I was looking for. So let me go back to that one specific species, and then I'll talk about a couple others as well that work. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so when I was talking about sunny, dry conditions, these are really just poor conditions for a plant to grow, and many marginal areas function just like this. So, John, do you know what the exact species is pictured here? Okay, so this isn't one of my personal slides. A lot of the other flowers are flowers that I use myself, but in a marginalized area, so in the beginning of the growing season, when you first start to see flowers bloom, in these marginalized areas, you'll probably see white clover establish initially, and then it'll either get phased out over time. So, and even more so than white clover is dandelion. So dandelion, the reason I don't include it is because there's kind of a lot of homeowner or land manager pushback, because by God, no matter what I say about bees, they just hate that that seed head. But dandelion does a really good job of establishing in marginalized soils, kind of low quality soils. And that's actually the reason that it's so prevalent. It can get in where other flowers can't.
I don't follow. How do we change perception of what is aesthetically pleasing? Dandelions to a lot of people are not aesthetically pleasing.
The quick answer is you drive to Prescott, Wisconsin, and talk to a room full of land managers about how good a dandelion is.
All right.
But the real answer is extension and education, outreach and education. You want to have talks like this, public talks, get in front of as many people as you can. provide resources on your websites, at a visitor center like this, maybe a brochure about how flowers that we traditionally view as weeds should be thought of as maybe from an ecological point of view. So they provide forage, they recycle nutrients, the green vegetation can recycle oxygen, can bring oxygen back into our landscapes. So really the answer to almost anything, in my opinion, whether it be changing perceptions or just anything across the board, is empower with education. Okay, so, oh yeah.
I got a couple questions. So on some of the Carrots blends, is there an example that any of us can see in the Twin Cities of somebody who's like testing a Carrots lawn, or is there a nice just
Yeah.
see?
So I'm pretty sure Blue Thumb uses a lot of sedges in their blooming boulevards. But John, do you know exactly where they are?
I know of one block in the Harrison neighborhood of Minneapolis, and it's around the Redeemer Lutheran Church. All sides of it's a large city block, and 3 sides of it are planted with different blooming boulevards, including a bunch of different sedges. Beyond that, they are being put in here and there, but I personally don't know where here and there is. Couldn't point you to them.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of this research is pretty new, so I know from my end, we worked on the establishment first, and we're first starting to put it in public spaces. So I established these bee lawns in 4 public parks in Minneapolis just last year. So we're kind of it's kind of like we're just excited as you guys are to see how these work in practice versus in theory. But there are some sites for pilot studies where we've seen that these have really great potential, that they've been pretty darn successful.
And then 2 other questions. One, have you used bulbs much for like early spring ephemerals? And is there anything you can recommend for that, or?
Yeah. So that's one of the questions that I get most, is just different flowers to consider. And unfortunately, the handicap I have there is funding. So I only get a limited amount of funding for my grant sources, and we kind of have to just choose which flowers we think have the highest potential. So I haven't tried bulbs yet, but I there's probably a couple dozen flowers that I would want to see how they work in these situations.
Then I guess my last question, sorry. Best season to install, I've heard both, like spring or fall. And so is there a preference that you have, and why?
Okay, so for installation, I tend to be a very strong supporter of a dormant seeding in the late fall. So I say late fall, but what you're really reacting off of is soil temperatures. And what we want to do is focus in on soil temperature right around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason for that is we want it to be too cold for anything to come to bloom, come to germinate right off the bat, because if they germinate right before that winter freeze, they'll just die off. But we don't want those soils to be frozen yet, because if their soils are frozen, the roots are never going to establish there. So that 45-degree area is that perfect happy medium where it's not going to germinate, but the roots can get established. And by establishing in the late fall rather than early spring, what you're doing is you're reducing competition. So you do that dormant seeding, your plants are established, the roots are in the ground, they're set to go once the debris is accumulate. If you plant in early spring, what you risk is that some of the flowers that have overwintered might already be starting to grow, might already be starting to get ready to bloom, and there's kind of going to be an increased level of competition for your target flora, your target ground cover to compete. That being said, spring can work, and the differences aren't too extreme, but I tend to favor the fall dormant seeding.
So you say install in the fall, so you mean like all these fescues, like what install in the fall?
Okay.
Any of the grasses, any of the perennials, any of the...
So I'm mostly thinking from the viewpoint of forbs, so from the flowers. So it's a turfgrass species. If you're generally going to seed that into a bare soil or overseeded, and turfgrass, the reason we use it is because they're such great competitors. So if you're looking to overseed a lawn, that's a little less sensitive. The early spring or the late fall will probably both be successful. But if you're trying to co-establish flowers with grass or put in new flowers altogether, that's really what I'm targeting for during seeding.
So, can I ask a question?
So,
Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, but you'll, I'm sure
If
there's
you
one.
allow like violets or dandelions or whatever to grow in your mix, how do you keep them out of your borders?
Yeah, so I believe we had a question somewhat, it was you and Beck before? Correct. So a similar question where, I'm okay with having these flowers on my property, but that doesn't mean that my neighbors do. And what you do is you want to kind of establish a border within your property lines. So many people will seed their grass to the full extent of the land that they manage. But what I would recommend is if you're concerned with how your neighbor perceives these flowers, maybe they don't want them into your lawn, is you want to create some sort of physical barrier along the perimeter of your property. So along your fence line, your property line.
But if they blow in from like the dandelion seeds blow, how?
Yeah, so they do blow, and if you're worried about any sort of spreading, then you really just want to have a either a wider buffer zone, or maybe you just limit the area that you seed to such that the seeds won't blow over quite as much. So, but that is one of the main pushbacks that I see is that the people who come to these kind of talks are very receptive, but they can't control what their neighbors are comfortable with. So yeah, maybe you would want to limit your plantings to areas where even if there is some wind blow, maybe there's a shed or some structure that's going to block the spread, or if you have a large space between yours and your neighbor's property line such that the capacity for seeds to blow over is minimized.
We already have quite a wide area, like 8 to 10 feet between all the way around. But what do I do to keep them out of my border? You just live it?
So I guess what I first have
It's
to
not gonna go into
understand.
their yard because it's too far away, but it sure can make a mess in my yard.
Okay, so
Or my borders.
what I have to do is I have to kind of be able to visualize your lawn. So your border, what exactly is your border?
Perennials, pollinator type perennials.
Okay,
And I don't know that it's a good idea to have a whole bunch of dandelions in there competing with them.
correct. Yeah, correct. So is there any impervious surface, so any non-living surface between your perennial ground cover and the space where you're worried about perennials spreading? Excuse me, in the space where you're worried about dandelion spreading?
Just a 3-inch wide border.
And is that border, is it like rocks or wood chips, something that a plant can't establish in?
No.
So putting something like wood chips, like a thin rock bed in between can help. So there is still some potential for the seeds to carry over, but what it'll limit is the ability of roots to spread. So, they can spread through soil, but they can't penetrate past rocks. So having some sort of physical barrier in the form of an impervious surface can help to limit the spread of dandelions into your perennial ground cover.
And then we'd also recommend, if you just keep mulch on your perennial ground cover beds, that'll keep any seeds that fall from hitting the soil underneath and establishing. That'll keep many of the seeds that fall from establishing.
Okay, you got a question?
Yeah, so if I have actually pretty large open space in my backyard that right now is just mud because I just built the house. And I heard what you said about it's optimal to establish these things in the fall. So I'm wondering if there's a type of cover crop that it would be a good idea to plant before I'm actually able to set this up to kind of.
So if you have mud, does that mean that you don't currently have anything growing within it?
That's what it means.
Okay, so then you don't really have to worry about a cover crop or anything. So the main reason that I recommended that fall planting was to reduce competition from other growing species.
Okay.
You're in this unique situation where you have bare ground and nothing to compete with, so you could just, and when we seed, what we're trying to have is direct seed to soil contact.
Okay.
So you have bare ground and nothing competing with it, so you could just go ahead and drop seed.
Oh, okay.
And if you want, what you can do is maybe there are some unintended weedy species or what I call like, flowers that you didn't intend for that establish within it, you can possibly, do a spot treatment or weed those out of your area and then overseed in the fall with a little bit of starter fertilizer, so fertilizer that has a little bit of phosphorus in it, and that can supplement what you put down right off the bat.
One technique I heard was to do an annual to establish, and then the annual dies off, so you don't deal with erosion. And have you heard of that technique?
No, I haven't.
So, do you know any landscapers who help with this?
So I know for sure that Rainbow Tree Care in the Twin Cities does. What I don't know is their range and how far they're willing to travel to a consumer.
What's it called again?
Rainbow Tree Care.
We're very close to them.
Yeah. Well, you guys aren't all too far.
Well, Rainbow Tree Care came to Hastings, so.
Oh, okay.
But we're
Yes.
Wisconsin.
See,
But
You just have to document.
we're just over the bridge, so.
yeah, I got the Welcome to Wisconsin notification.
Just
Not
tell them it's Eastern Minnesota.
Oh, okay. So Creeping Charlie, I've had a lot of fun interactions with Creeping Charlie, and I'm from the East Coast, so I'm used to like a little bit of a rougher personality, a little bit of an edgier person, and here I was like, wow, everyone's so calm. And that was until you bring up Creeping Charlie, where the most mild-mannered Minnesotans turn into barbarians. So Creeping Charlie, I've actually gotten so many questions about it, where I've actually developed a Creeping Charlie management guide that's present on the University of Minnesota page, University of Minnesota Yard and Garden blog. And if anyone wants that, I can send it your way. So Creeping Charlie, I'll kind of give you the 2-minute overview. So, okay, first word, you have your Creeping Charlie. Is it everywhere or is it restricted to shady areas? Oh, excuse me, sorry, yes.
Let's go with everywhere. It's mostly shade.
Okay,
But it's
so I heard someone say everywhere, and you said mostly shade, so maybe I should just cover both, and what I can't cover, then I'd recommend the blog. So if it's restricted to mostly shade, that means you can kind of still be saved. So Creeping Charlie as a, which kind of gives some foreshadowing to, unfortunately, what I'm going to say to the I have Creeping Charlie everywhere people. But I'll start with mostly shade because that's a little more optimistic. So mostly shade. So Creeping Charlie, if you've kind of seen it a lot, the trend with Creeping Charlie is it tends to first establish under shady areas because it's incredibly well adapted to shady areas, and after that, because it's so aggressive, it can outcompete the natives or the intended species that you have in your lawn. And that really is the main difference between a naturalized species, like we talked about with white clover, and an invasive species, the ability to outcompete the natives that you have in your lawn. So what I would recommend you do is a spot treatment with an herbicide to get rid of the Creeping Charlie. And then what you're going to want to do is install a shade-adapted vegetation into that area where the Creeping Charlie was likely to initially penetrate. And that will restrict, or hopefully at least partially limit, the ability of the Creeping Charlie to get into your lawn and spread. So the idea is you probably were lacking a shade-tolerant forb in your yard, a shade-tolerant form of ground cover. So if you get that shade-tolerant ground cover underneath your trees, it's going to limit the ability of Creeping Charlie to penetrate.
So, the herbicide, is that will your safe herbicides work or?
Ooh, Creeping Charlie is a real bear. You're probably going to have to use a glyphosate, but if you do it as a spot treatment, then it'll limit those ecological negatives.
Do you know anything? I used a borax mixture.
What was that?
Borax and mixture. First I wet the area, then I had a solution of dish soap that cleaned the leaves, and I rinsed it, and then I had a borax mixture, and it did it. But I don't know how borax is with the soil.
So one of the graduate students in the turf lab, him and I have talked a little bit about that that treatment, that form of management that you've said. And I think on the So separate from the blog that I made, so there's additional U of M turf information about creeping Charlie management and kind of eco-friendly ways to at least attempt it. And I think with borax, it requires more than one application. So even if you remove the plant material, you want to make sure that it can't come back. So you really want to make sure it's totally dead. Kind of like when you're pulling a weed, you don't want to get just the inflorescence, you want to get it from the root up, you want to get the entirety of the plant. So I think with that form of control, you want to do more than one application over the span of a few weeks. But I would double check the U of M resources on that. So I just want to, I'll get to you, but someone muttered, what if the creeping Charlie's everywhere, right?
Yep, that's me.
Okay, okay, so I wish that I could save you, but I'm not a magician. So what you're gonna wanna do is, if it's really bothering you to the point where you want to just have a complete renovation, is you're gonna have to do one of those, either a solarization, one of those full turf grass lawn removal techniques, and just start from scratch. So it's a little bit more expensive, but you do get that benefit of you're starting over, you're starting fresh, you have some, untarnished soil to seed into. But yeah, a lawn overcome with creeping Charlie, gosh, I wish there were an answer, I'd be rich.
Right, well, and the fact of the matter is I mow over 2 acres, so it's not, that's why I'm trying to cut it down. And and I know that people don't like creeping Charlie, but I have some beautiful images of more than 3 different kinds of bees last spring feeding on the flowers, and it was early, and so, in defense of creeping Charlie, I've just live with it, really. But if there's, and I was just wondering, because it's a creeper again, is it going, you said it will outcompete native plantings, right?
Yeah. So a little bit on creeping Charlie and pollinators. So the blog that I have is in 2 sections. It's creeping Charlie management and creeping Charlie for pollinators. And something that my advisor, my boss Marla, said once that I totally hijacked because I thought it was really funny was that any flowers is better than no flowers, and any flower is better than creeping Charlie. And this is a bit of an exaggeration. So some research in the 1980s did find that pollinators do receive a net reward from foraging on creeping Charlie, but it's certainly not an ideal source of forage. And that's because, firstly, it doesn't provide any pollen to pollinators, so they're not getting any protein out of their visitations. And the nectar that it does produce, it has this kind of like jackpot reward system where I'm sure you people here, some of you have at least played pull tabs. So it's no different from a pull tab where eventually, I see some chuckles, where sometimes, few and far between, you get that really big reward that makes you think, wow, this is a worthy investment, I should buy 400 pull tabs. But for the most part, you keep peeling those pull tabs, you keep visiting those flowers, and it's very low volumes of reward, very low likelihood to receive a reward, but often when you do, it's a high volume reward that says, come back to me.
You should have.
We'll go down the line, 1, 2, 3.
Not to give out an endorsement, but there is a landscaping, outback nursery and landscaping just across the river. That might be a source view.
I need ground ivy, is that also invasive?
I believe ground ivy is the common name for creeping Charlie. Is that correct? Okay, yeah. So, what we just discussed, they're 2 and 1 and the same.
Well, they look
No, they're synonymous. They're the same thing, just 2 different common names. So, Glaucoma hederaceae is the Latin name, and some people call it creeping Charlie, some people call it ground ivy.
okay, but it's something else that's creeping in my yard.
You showed a slide that was a hill, and what did you say was planted on that hill?
Okay. Yeah, hills are a major pain.
And my house is about 3 blocks down that way. So it's southwest. Beautiful view, but hot, dry.
So I take it you've had some issues seeding that area in the past?
Well, we've only lived there one summer, so we haven't done anything with it.
Okay, so what I would recommend is the use of a germination blanket. Are you familiar with what that is? So a germination blanket is it's kind of like a thin, papery almost sheet that's put over a new lawn seeding area, and it's typically put in to trap moisture, so to ensure that moisture is there throughout the germination period of grass species. But what it can also do is help to keep seed in place. So with a slope, as you'd imagine, there's a lot of seed that's going to be carried by rainwater that's going to just drift off onto your sidewalk or whatever you have at the bottom of your slope. So putting in that germination blanket can help to keep whatever you're seeding in place. But gosh, slopes are tough. That's one where you'd want to have someone like Sam from our lab or some other landscape architect kind of get a first-hand view of the challenges that you're facing. So
That's what I want.
you know, from the U, I'd recommend.
My husband is not really interested in this. That's why I'm
Oh, believe me, I know that this isn't for everyone. So from the U, I'd recommend contacting Sam. John might have others from Blue Thumb who would give some insight.
Sure, yeah, maybe now is a good time to say exactly what Blue Thumb is. We're a partnership organization. We have over 45 public and private partners, kind of centered in the metro area, but kind of extending throughout the Midwest. And so that's watershed districts, cities, soil and water conservation districts, as well as on the private side, native plant nurseries, ecologically minded landscapers. And we have a website, bluethumb.org, and there's a partner finder tool. So if you're interested in finding someone who can help with turf alternatives, bluethumb.org/partners, you can find, you can search for, we have 4 or 6 partners that help with turf alternatives. We don't yet have a feature on the website to kind of a location search feature, so you might have to call some of them and see if they will come all the way across the river here. But it's definitely worth a good shot.
Oh, but you too.
Oh.
Well, I'll have to take a look at that. Well, any other questions?
All right, I'll jump in again.
Yeah,
Because I've got such a big lawn that I want to stop mowing. But it's so big that that's what the overwhelming part of it is, just like, where do I start? I mean, there are certain, like right by our entrance, I'd rather kind of keep that just as a regular, like a dooryard, typical lawn, but the rest of it can go. Doesn't have any traffic. And I don't, it's just like I don't have big equipment to deal with it, and I suppose I could do it in chunks, but that's gonna take me 10 years, so.
Yeah, doing it in chunks is going to take a long time and be a little exhaustive. So equipment, even if you don't have it, it can be rented.
Mhm.
I believe in the past I've rented like industrial mowers and aerators.
I have an industrial mower.
Oh, okay, so you got the equipment then. So I guess since I had already started, those generally cost between $20 and $60 an hour to rent, but they get the job done. So okay, so if you have the mower, so what would you say is your kind of limiting resource?
Time, money.
Oh boy.
Because, just the size of the lawn, and like I said, it's like 2 acres worth.
Yeah. So are you looking to start from scratch or maybe go with an overseeding?
Whatever works the best. I mean, I know that if I start from scratch, I will, and of course I've got the creeping Charlie issue too, so.
Yeah. So what's tough is this mix of stressors that you're facing. So time, money, and creeping Charlie. Those are those are three bears to deal with. Gosh. So normally, if time is an issue, then I would recommend like outsourcing to a land care company. And if money is an issue, I would recommend an overseeding. So kind of doing it yourself, mowing super low, and then planting a more desirable species in place. But since you also have creeping Charlie, it's probably going to outcompete. So you almost have to like weigh each of the challenges that you're facing against each other and kind of choose the least cumbersome option.
Do you know anybody who wants to do a pilot project?
Yeah. I get so around this time of year between like February and April, I probably get like like 2 of those a week where it's like, hey, I've got some land that you should do some research on. I've already hit my carrying capacity. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing overseeding, if you have just like traditional lawn.
Yeah.
And you do an overseeding, is the fescues gonna outcompete your lawn, or is the lawn just gonna keep growing up
Okay, so the
between the
first step.
fescues?
Yeah, I see where you're getting. So the first step is to identify the species of grass that you have present. In all likelihood, it's probably Kentucky bluegrass. And what you're gonna wanna do is, yes, that overseeding, and also you're gonna wanna use the strengths of the fine fescue against the Kentucky bluegrass. So those characteristics that make the fine fescue low input, the fact that it doesn't require as much fertilizer and it doesn't require as much irrigation, if you stop treating your lawn in the way that allows Kentucky bluegrass to survive, so you make it nutrient limited and you don't irrigate so that it's water limited as well, over time the fine fescue should start to take over the Kentucky bluegrass because it's not receiving the nitrogen input and the water input that it needs to survive and be healthy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, except I guess I don't water the lawn.
Okay.
So,
Did you fertilize?
no.
Oh, wow. So this is one of those rare situations where you have really high quality soil and that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
So then you might have to do one of those lawn renovations.
Okay.
But the good thing is there that you have a wonderful lawn that a lot of people would, beg for. So yeah, with either sod cutting, and even still you should get some establishment of the fine fescue from, especially if you do a scalp beforehand, from the scalp and overseeding. But if you kind of want to replace what's the dominant species and do it quickly, then you would want to do one of those more full-on renovation techniques. That
Just kind of build off of that, I guess. So I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. Is that I thought I took away from this that, if you're doing like a bee lawn, scalp, aerate, overseed.
Yep.
Great idea. But if you're doing a no-mow, I thought maybe the preferred practice would be to do just like a full overhaul versus, so you say, it sounds like you're saying though right now that you can be successful just doing the same process as you would a bee lawn, where you're just like scalping, aerating, overseeding with a no-mow?
So if you're overseeding, you're most likely going to have a mixture of species, but your lawn will be lower input than it was previously.
Okay.
If you want to have kind of the monoculture that we're used to, but a monoculture of a lower input species, then you're going to want to do that full renovation.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, thank you.
And maybe the last thing, James touched on it for a moment, and we passed slides back and forth. I think 1 or 2 got lost in the shuffle. But one really important thing is, if you have healthy soil, if you have thriving Kentucky bluegrass that you don't put anything in to get it that way, the best thing and easiest thing you can do is let it grow higher rather than lower. Turfgrass roots generally grow as deep, relative to how tall the blades get. And the deeper the roots go, the more water can be infiltrated in the soil, the more it can break up compaction, the more carbon they can store. And so taller lawns are better lawns to some extent.
And to build on that, so I was kind of talking about these lawn species from the biological point of view and how low input works. But if you have Kentucky bluegrass and you're not watering it and you're not adding fertilizer, then it's already functioning as a low input lawn. And there are cultivars of Kentucky bluegrass that are more low input than others, so it's possible that you have a low input variety of Kentucky bluegrass already installed. But if you're not, using constant inputs of water and constant inputs of fertilizer, then your lawn is not a problem in terms of inputs, in terms of being eco-friendly. Yeah, because if changing to if changing to fine fescue wouldn't alter your practices, if your lawn can still function as low input even with Kentucky bluegrass, then you're fine.
So are there places out on the St. Paul campus where you can see some of these examples of pine fescues? And I know you showed something outside of one of those, what was it, the bee lab? But I know there's fields and there's gardens and everything else.
So the St. Paul campus, off the top of my head, there's the area in front of the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. There's an area in front of Alderman Hall that's actually labeled as a living lab because it's like I'll call it a trial of fine fescue, but it's really just a fine fescue lawn that's saying here is a low input lawn. You guys should all do this. There's also some fine fescue plots in the TRO Center, which stands for Turfgrass Research, Outreach, and Extension, which is just across the campus from where all the just across the street from where all the academic buildings are. And for the most part, where we don't have golf greens growing, we're doing a lot of different experiments with fine fescue. So not in front of Alderman Hall, but to the side of it is where we have some Nomo growing. Let me think. Oh, okay. Shoot. So this is also off one of the dirt roads, which, gosh, that doesn't really help. But when you turn off Gortner, you drive past the bee lab, and just after the the sites that the ag students use, there's a little nursery area for the horticulture people. And that has been converted to, first it was converted to fine fescue. And then when the first student who started doing bee lawn work came here, he said, well, this is as good an area as any to drop some bee lawn seeds. So it's actually fine fescue with some bee lawn flowers blooming, and it's been going since 2014, so I guess this is the 4th year. And it's really nice. There's a mixture of self-heal, clover, and thyme growing. So it's a really neat little area that's not a research project, but it's kind of a more realistic example of what it might look like in practice.
Yeah, by the dirt. But it's on.
Okay, John, so I guess I'll hand it to you now.
All right, yeah, I guess that wraps up our Turf Alternatives presentation. Thank you all for coming out.